and that's where
We're getting little precursors up here about what it's all about. So I think we've seen a bit of movement happen. Some folks come and some folks move, but we want to welcome you to our next session here in this room this morning. And so we have Dr. Andy Roebuck, who has been working at Yukon University in the psychology area there, who's going to walk us through a conversation on vitamin D and mental wellness. So welcome, Andy.
Hi, everybody. So I do realize that I am standing in the way of dinner or lunch. So what I'm going to try and do is we've been here for 2 days now. We've had a lot of good discussions. We've had some hard discussions, and we've had some more lighthearted ones. I am definitely going to be erring on the side of lighthearted because I got to keep you entertained and motivated before lunch. So that's what to expect going forward. So I want to start because, of course, I'm presenting. I obviously want to talk about myself. It's the key. So it's just to center myself, give me a bit of background. So what I do is I'm currently an assistant professor in psychology at Yukon U, and my background is really in the biological basis of neurological and psychiatric illness. That's what I care about. So I care about the underpinnings of psychopathology. How is this represented in the brain and in our biology? Now, with that, I've actually been really lucky. I've had a lot of unique research opportunities. I spent a lot of time researching cannabis, including effects of prenatal cannabis exposure, cannabis in epilepsy, cannabis in schizophrenia, and these were really exciting projects for me. I'm actually just kind of winding down that part of research. So what I'm presenting on today is really prospective research, new areas I want to start investigating going forward. So I actually don't have any of my own data to share for you. It's all about ideas and looking forward and starting to understand where we can be researching in this area and where are the gaps. So I'm in the process of developing this program, interested in factors that affect mental wellness in the North, but it's still in the early stages. We're talking months, years, and as I keep getting older, decades of research yet. So long time yet. Now, as we talk about this subject, and this is a really critical point here, I am not a physician. I am not a dietitian. I am not a therapist. All those helpful things you think about healthcare professionals doing, I don't do any of them. I sit in a lab. I read papers. I'm a scientist by training. So what I'm talking about today is really from the science side of things. So don't take it as your personal medical advice. I am not giving you advice on your situation, your health, your well-being. We're speaking generally. So please don't, report me for giving unlicensed medical advice. That's not what's happening here. So with that said, I said I wanted to keep this lighthearted. I want to keep everyone engaged. So I'm going to start this talk the best way I know how, and that's with a naked picture of myself. Oh, no, we're going to skip that. There it is. There's my naked picture of me. And I apologize for any mental imagery that might have conjured up, but that is very much me. That is my brain. It is relatively typical as far as one could hope for based on what you've seen so far. I have some complaints, but overall, it's a pretty typical brain. And this is really the subject of my research, is looking at the brain, not just my brain, but brains generally. And it's really the center of thought. It's the center of our feelings, and it's the center of cognition. The brain is composed of many different small little cells and different units. The main one we talk about usually is the neuron or the nerve cell. 80 billion plus of these nerve cells interact with each other, and they create a pattern of electrochemical activity that you feel as thought, as emotion, as consciousness, as learning, as memory. It is that pattern of activity. I don't know why this is clicking forward on me, but we'll roll with the punches. So this pattern of activity, these nerve cells communicating with one another, is your conscious perception of the world. It is your mood. It is your thought. And these patterns of activity are affected by things like neurotransmitters. So those are pretty commonly talked about these days, things like dopamine and serotonin. These modulate and alter these patterns of electricity. They alter these patterns of thought. So anything that impacts these neurons, anything that changes this pattern of electrical activity, this pattern of communication in your brain, can change the way you think, act, or feel. Sounds good. Okay. Problems are that neurons, critical to life, I usually describe them as our little trust fund babies. They're very sensitive, they're very delicate, and they require a lot of support. So they use a lot of our energy. About 20% of the calories you consumed at rest go just to keeping these whiny little babies alive. They don't even feed themselves. They need it delivered to them, and they don't even do their dishes. They don't take it away. They also are very picky eaters, consuming mostly blood glucose, and they're highly specialized and, like I said, very delicate. They're extremely sensitive to disruptions in their internal environment and deficiencies, such as those we might see with like vitamin D. So we have these sensitive trust fund babies. They can't support themselves, and they're totally reliant on the rest of your body. So what happens when we start affecting the rest of the body? We stop providing them with this critical environment they need to survive. That's really the area of study I'm interested in. Now, I would be a terrible academic if I didn't give us a pop quiz. So it is required by law. It's not up to me. So we're going to go through this vitamin D pop quiz. I promise I will not mark you harshly on this. Apparently I grade way too easily, say my students. But let's start with question 1. How's vitamin D produced? Are there lots in red meat, added to table salt, ultraviolet light, or is it just simply magic? Magic, obviously, is the answer, and that magic in the form of ultraviolet light. So, yeah. So, yes, vitamin D synthesized by the skin or in the skin after exposure to UVB radiation. How far north before you start needing to look at vitamin D supplementation, before your production of vitamin D is going to be impacted? San Francisco, Vancouver, Prince George, or Whitehorse? Oh, yeah, we're talking San Francisco. The 37th parallel. So that's where the 37th parallel is. We are somewhere up here, way off the slide at this point. So anywhere above the 37th parallel, for at least some part of the year, you are incapable of producing enough vitamin D following UVB exposure. We can't make enough vitamin D in Boston, 42nd parallel, 4 months of the year. In Edmonton, 5 months of the year, that's the 53rd parallel. Whitehorse, we're right around the 60th parallel, at least 6 months of the year. And when we start looking at Dawson City at 64, Old Crow at around 68, at least 7 to 8 months of the year, even if you spent 24 hours naked outside in the sun, what little bit you could get, insufficient vitamin D production based on UVB radiation. So it has to do with basically where the sun sits in the sky. You don't get a good angle. And you see that even in the summer months up north, you need longer exposure times compared to individuals down south. So more time spent outside. Okay, a couple more questions with the quiz. Hopefully you keep doing well. I'm sure everyone's got 100% so far. So you might be thinking to yourself, I'm outside a lot in the summer. I'll have enough vitamin D stored for the winter. True or false? Yeah, love it. I mean, I don't love it. It's bad. It's not ideal. But no, it is very unlikely that, especially in northern climates like this, that we have enough vitamin D stored to last the winter following even a summer working outside. So maybe you're a cat. You decide, fine, you convinced me. I'm going to sit in front of that window. I'm going to bask in sunlight. That's how I'm going to live my life. I'm going to turn my entire house into a solarium. That's going to help you, right? Obviously, you know where I'm going with this. No, it isn't. Window glass, like in a car or a house, blocks UVB light and it blocks vitamin D production. So you can sit there in your solarium taking in sunlight. It's not helping with vitamin D production. I have more things to ruin for you. SPF 15 sunscreen, really critical and important for sun safety and health in our environment, blocks 90% of vitamin D production. So that's a pretty common SPF to be found in simple lotions. There is also a flip side to this. We want to practice good skincare, good skin health, but now we're inhibiting our body's ability to produce vitamin D. I have one last almost question. It's not even phrased as a question. I gave up on this long ago. Sure, most of us must be getting enough vitamin D from the food we eat. In Canada, we have fortified foods, fortified grains, fortified milk, eggs. Almost certainly not. Like, I didn't even bother making this a question. You know where I'm going with this. There's consistent evidence that even with fortification approaches, we are still seeing vitamin D levels lower than we'd like. For example, if you want to get your daily dose of vitamin D from eggs, a dozen eggs at least every single day. So I know people who have chickens might have that egg supply, but I do not. So it's actually quite difficult to get vitamin D in a northern environment from diet alone. Not impossible, mind you, but it can be very difficult. So globally, when we look at estimates of vitamin D insufficiency, we see conservative estimates suggest about 1 billion people worldwide are probably insufficient or deficient in vitamin D. These numbers probably underestimate the actual incidence. Some studies get as high as a quarter. I've seen one result suggest 50% of people. That's probably honestly too high. But even if we're talking 1 in 8, well, where do you think many of those 1 in 8 live? Further up you go, the more difficult vitamin D production occurs. So more myth busting. Vitamin D, it's called a vitamin. Technically, it's a fat soluble prohormone. It's not even a vitamin. We've been lied to our entire life. It's produced in response to UVB light. And despite this ability to produce vitamin D for ourselves, we still see that deficiency is quite common. And when we look at studies that have evaluated vitamin D in the north, places like the NWT and Nunavut, we saw insufficiencies ranging from 63% of tested populations all the way up to 100% of tested populations would have below the recommended levels of vitamin D. Similar in Alaska, similar in the northern prairies. Not particularly thrilling public health data when we look at factors like this. Now, levels of deficiency can even be higher in certain groups. So when we talk about people who might have a darker skin complexion, with age, we see vitamin D production decrease, pregnancy status, activity levels, time spent outside, diet, especially when we look at things like salmon consumption, very high in vitamin D, one of our few natural sources that are very rich in it. Access to traditional foods. They've done interventional studies where increasing access to traditional foods improves vitamin D levels. So these levels aren't consistent. It's not about each individual in that area is going to have the same outcome. We have to really start, taking a more holistic approach. We have to consider a person's lifestyle, their behaviors, how much time do they spend basking in the sun like a cat, and what are they eating? So vitamin D, we often think about it as an essential part of like calcium and phosphorus balance. People always say it's good for your bones and your teeth. It is. Don't get me wrong. I'm not bashing bones or anything like that. The skeleton's important. Brain's obviously the most important thing, but the skeleton's fine, I guess. Vitamin D is absolutely essential for the health of our skeleton, but it does a lot more. Immune functions, cardiovascular functions, digestion, glycemic control, control of sugars, neuron growth and stability, the physical growth of those brain cells, how they function in early adulthood, in middle adulthood, in later life, regulation of our neurotransmitter systems like dopamine and serotonin, and much, much more. Vitamin D is involved in all these factors. And so when we say it's good for your bones, we're missing a lot of areas where it's also playing a very critical role physiologically. Oh, I do have this important caveat. Don't immediately go home and eat a bunch of vitamin D. Excessive vitamin D can cause adverse outcomes here. So the upper limit is recommended to be about 4,000 IU. So usually if you have like a supplement that you picked up at the store, it's probably about 1,000 IU. So the upper limit is about 4,000 a day, usually recommended. You do not want to exceed these levels without talking to your physician, your healthcare team. It can cause over expression of calcium in the blood. So there are some side effects. It isn't something you can just go, don't buy a bottle today, eat the whole thing in your car or something like that. That is not what I am recommending here. Remember, no medical advice. So I'm very much interested in how vitamin D impacts the brain and how it affects our nervous system. And so I stole this really nice infographic, but I realized that the text is probably a bit too small for many people to see. So I'll mostly go through it. Vitamin D, it circulates through the blood and it actually enters the brain by crossing through something called the blood-brain barrier. Remember, our brain is filled with neurons that are trust fund babies. They in fact live in a gated community in your body. And so they are kept very separate and safe. And so vitamin D can actually just readily cross into that gated community, hop over the fences. Now, in I don't know what's happening here. Yeah, next there, yeah. Oh no. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, you can put a few up at once. So in the brain, we see that vitamin D, it acts on those neurons. It acts on those nerve cells quite directly. And for those of you who might have a bit of familiarity with the nervous system, it also acts on the support system for the brain. Remember, they can't take care of themselves. They rely on people to do the work or other cells to do the work for them. So we have a whole slate of things called glial cells. For you, just think of them as your support network. They're taking care of cleaning, they're taking care of providing food, and they're taking care of making sure that everything in that little gated community that is your brain is kept clean and nice. The neurons, the glial cells, they all react directly to vitamin D. So they carry with them vitamin D receptors in their cellular membranes and in their nucleus. Now, when vitamin D enters these cells, it acts in a lot of different ways. There's some complex signaling that I'm sure no one cares about but me here, unless if you want to talk about protein kinases, in which case, let's get. No? Okay. So it talks about, they have a lot of these complex signaling pathways, but they also affect the expression of many genes. So an element of our genetics is represented by the activity of vitamin D. And we do see population-based differences in which genes are expressed and exactly what they code for. So vitamin D, it's doing quite a lot in the brain. It's acting on all these different cell types, and we do know that vitamin D insufficiency impacts, can I get another click here? Impacts the health of the brain throughout the life. So in early life, the prenatal period, infancy, childhood, we see that vitamin D insufficiency is associated with the increased likelihood to experience symptoms related to ADHD, certain types of autism spectrum disorders, anxiety-based behaviors, depression, and schizophrenia. So there's pretty convincing evidence at broader population levels that when we see low exposure to vitamin D, especially during the first and second trimester of pregnancy, or in early childhood when the nervous system is doing its greatest level of development, an increased likelihood of each of these conditions. Now, I want to be clear here, we're not talking about causality here. We don't have the evidence to suggest that this deficiency alone is causing these conditions to occur. But in populations that are vitamin D deficient, especially in early life, we do see an increased rate of these conditions. So we do know vitamin D plays a critical role in neural development. So when neurons grow, they branch, they make connections, they build that gated community. That's a really finely tuned process. So anything that messes with that system impacts neural development. So can I get another click here? When we move into adulthood, a kind of new topical area of research has been looking at vitamin D and aspects of depression symptoms. And there does seem to be a relationship between vitamin D insufficiency and depression. Now, there's also a recent study looking at symptoms of bipolar disorders as well. Again, similar relationship being observed. But the interesting aspect of this seems to be distinct from any sort of just general exposure to light. So it's not that people aren't being exposed or getting outside or getting exercise. It seems to be more strongly associated with limited or low levels of vitamin D. So things like light therapy, many of you probably have like a SAD lamp or something like that at home. I do. I really love it. It seems to be really good for our neural health in the winter. Does nothing for vitamin D production, but it does help in other ways. So can I get one more there? Perfectly. Now, the mechanisms related to vitamin D and depression and bipolar disorder and these symptoms in adulthood, fairly murky. We don't really understand these connections yet. So we don't have any sort of kind of causal relationship here. This is mostly correlative evidence. So that's stuff that needs to be evaluated much more fully as we go forward. So when we look at later life, vitamin D is associated with a number of different symptoms and symptomologies that are certainly clinically relevant. We see that vitamin D levels are associated with the symptomology and progression of diabetes. It can affect how and to what extent nervous system damage occurs when in individuals who are diabetic. Again, kind of appropriate levels of vitamin D seem to be having a protective effect. We see a relationship between vitamin D and symptom severity in things like MS or multiple sclerosis, playing a role in the remyelinating and demyelinating processes, if you're familiar with MS as its pathology. And recently, there's been a lot of research looking at the development and progression of dementia symptoms and looking at vitamin D status in those populations. And so I want to spend a bit more time talking about that. In vitamin D and dementia, what we see is this recent study come out in 2023. So this was Calgary, 12,000 or so individuals are followed for a 10-year period. Now, when we see this, you can see these two lines here. I know it's a bit far, it's a bit hard to see from back there. What these two lines represent is diagnosis of or a risk to development of dementia. So basically, the longer a line stays near the top, that indicates a better outcome. It indicates a longer time period, 10 years across this chart here, where an individual did not receive a diagnosis of dementia in later life. The blue line at the top here is those individuals who were supplementing with vitamin D. This was self-directed supplementation. The red line here is individuals who had no prior exposure to vitamin D, did not take any extra efforts to add vitamin D to their diet, take a supplement, no excessive food consumption and food rich in vitamin D. So that's our differences here. What this works out to is a 40% reduction in the incidence of depression over the course of this study. So that is a huge effect size, absolutely massive. Even if this is overstating it tenfold and it was only a 4% reduction, that is still massive when we talk about population level effects. So we don't just see this in isolated individuals, we do see differential effects in different populations. It seems that females were more protected by vitamin D than we see with the male participants in the study. And it does seem to kind of ameliorate or protect from some of these effects associated with dementia, such as mild cognitive impairment. Now, this really indicates to us, and this is not alone, there are a ton of studies looking down this avenue, that vitamin D should really be considered a part of dementia protection, especially for these high-risk strata. The evidence is honestly quite compelling. So for me, it's nice to see these types of data because one thing about vitamin D is it's quite cheap to administer. It's very easy to get it to the people who need it. So these and others really suggest that there's this protective effect of vitamin D, and this can be really beneficial to age-related or illness-related cognitive impairment. So something that I'm sure we're all glad to hear is that we could be taking a supplement and it might be having this protective effect. Now, looking forward, I said that I don't have any data yet. This is prospective work that I'm going to be starting up over the next months, years, and let's be honest, I still have to work for a lot longer, so decades. So this is stuff that I'm looking forward to doing, and I'm starting to build these research programs and kind of establish this framework. So there's a lot going on with vitamin D, and there's a lot that impacts the brain. We talked about many different areas here. I skipped over tons, different aspects of neurotransmitter systems, how it affects our immune response, how vitamin D might be involved in inflammatory responses. It actually seems to increase amyloid beta solubility, which is really great to hear for people who might be looking at Alzheimer's research or treating people with Alzheimer's disease. And it affects glucocorticoid signaling, stress hormones. So these are all areas that we didn't really talk about today. If you're like me and interested in this field, there's quite a lot to navigate. But there's a lot more details, a lot more nuance, and a lot more caveats here. In 20 minutes, we can't cover every exception, every kind of little piece here. But what can we start looking at? And that's really what I want to talk about here, and we're really just starting this dialogue going forward. So I really want to do research in the North that benefits people in the North in collaboration and cooperation with people in the North. I know, weird conference to be at for that. I get it. It's an odd place to be. And my hope is eventually that we can actually do quite a lot of this research, but it can't happen in isolation. So we need to get conversations, consultations, and planning started because groups react to vitamin D differently. Groups have different needs and they have different challenges and they have different resiliencies. So we need to be carefully looking at individual groups. We can't look at Northerners as a whole homogenous group even. Different experiences. So it becomes quite a lot more complicated. So there's going to be all this boring stuff, establishing research protocols, building connections, building capacity, getting our tools together. Well, I briefly want to touch on some of these areas of research to give us ideas going forward and kind of highlight some of my research goals now. These are very broad ideas because we're starting this consultation process. We're still building these partnerships and these connections. So I'm going to highlight a few areas of research kind of across three main domains. And if I come back, if they let me back in the building next year to show another naked picture of myself, God forbid. But, well, maybe I'll have some data to share. So, three main research areas. The first of which is the one that really this is my background. It's investigating mechanisms of how vitamin D and how vitamin D insufficiency might impact the structure and function of the nervous system. So I've spent a lot of time looking at developmental neuroscience research, and this is an area that I'm quite excited for. This is the area that our timeline to get started and working on is in the months. And so this is lab-based research. This is doing things with cell culture work, with our model systems, looking at elements related to the gut microbiota and how that might impact them. This is that type of work. It tends to happen, in the depths of the basements of the research institutes. That's where I hang out. So that's one aspect of our work, and our timeline is really months to be starting moving in that direction. Now, the stuff that's more relevant to what we've been talking about here over the past day and a half is more population-wide work. And so we know that the Yukon is full of a bunch of people from diverse backgrounds with diverse experiences, diverse needs, and diverse resiliencies. Vitamin D has been studied in the territory, but a lot of these studies have been fairly superficial, and they haven't always assessed kind of the unique characteristics of different populations. We have a tendency to group everyone together so that we have enough numbers so that we can get our significance stars and we can make pretty graphs, things we've talked about a few times over the week. So timeline to start some more population-wide work is really in the months to years kind of perspective here. And so one of the first approaches will be to look at things like vitamin D perceptions, attitudes, our understanding, and our use. So think about the myth busting we did earlier. Did many of you kind of confront some misconceptions you have? How many other people out there have these misconceptions? What is our general knowledge related to vitamin D and how it's produced and how it affects our bodies? Frankly, we don't always know. And as a little aside, anytime I talk about doing vitamin D research, the number one response I get from everybody is, oh, I should really start taking it again. And everybody has a sad pill bottle that's sitting above their sink and it's crusty and old and everyone knows it's there, but we want to understand that relationship. We want to understand why people are choosing to use and why people might not be choosing to use. So this might involve population sampling, correlative or associative studies, monitoring studies, and then if we end up developing further, you could look at cost benefit analysis and program evaluation. Perhaps we're able to introduce supplementation into communities that might need it. So timelines for these types of projects are months and years. The last area is really targeted research and evaluation, and the timeline for this is really into the years. And this is where community partnership, connection with the individuals involved is going to be critical. We know that some individuals, some communities are particularly at risk, but we also know that some communities and some individuals might have heightened resiliency to vitamin D deficiencies. So the kind of standard of care right now is that everybody gets the same kind of level of vitamin D. This is where you're deficient, this is where you're insufficient, and that might not be the right way to approach this. There is evidence that individuals of certain populations and certain backgrounds might actually do more with less vitamin D wise. So they might be told to supplement when in really their bodies are doing quite well with lower levels. So this type of targeted work, it might look at, for example, elderly or older populations, looking at elements related to aging and how vitamin D might impact them. Again, that community we see less vitamin D from the diet, less production from UVB light. And certainly in the Yukon, in the north, we need to consider the relationship between vitamin D and different northern First Nations and communities and how this might impact their health and their well-being. So, a few examples from this area. Traditional foods. Many traditional foods are rich in vitamin D. And it is really nice in the territory. We do see a lot of support for the idea that people should be allowed to access traditional foods, spend time on their land, and they should be able to have this in hospital, in community, and wherever they go. That isn't true everywhere in the world, sadly, but we do see that certainly from a vitamin D perspective, when I think about it as a research, that's gold standard. Absolutely. We want more of that. So we do know things like salmon, liver, they're rich in vitamin D. Now, we have seen that previous studies might actually, that have encouraged traditional food consumption, helps improve vitamin D levels. Okay. Now, the last little part here is part of that resiliency side of things. Not everyone is the same. We have different behaviors and different experiences that affect how vitamin D affects our nervous system and our body. There's actually considerable evidence to suggest that First Nations individuals, especially those who were raised in the North, may have adaptive or protective changes to their vitamin D production and the structures that produce and use vitamin D that could be protective. They might be doing more with less. And so this becomes problematic when the same prescription guidelines are used for every different individual group, when we ignore the individual in healthcare, and this can actually have negative consequences. You can have too much vitamin D. So there is considerable evidence to suggest that there are different groups that might react differently. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I spent a lot of time trying to look at these relationships. Lots of people have suggested it. I found very little kind of direct evidence. Now, when we talk about this type of targeted research, thinking about the themes that we've talked about over this week or over these last few days, this is something that has to happen in consultation with these groups, with these individuals. So very much in the early planning stages, these studies should always happen in consultation and partnership. That's what I'm going to be looking at going forward. And again, the timeline to get these projects going is into the years. We're not going to be studying people taking blood samples in weeks. So that's really what I want to see going forward is I want to see a program looking at vitamin D in the North for Northerners and taking in the individual experiences of Northerners when we look at how it might impact them. So I kind of went a few minutes over here, but if we have time, questions or feedback, I'm happy to get it. Reach out to me, send me an email anytime, reach out directly, stop me in the street, show up at my house at 2 a.m., whatever works for you, you can get a hold of me, and I'm happy to talk about this research area. You can find the health guidelines for vitamin D are quite easy to access. I recommend you evaluate them for yourselves. And I have one last quiz. Who needs the D? We all need vitamin D. I will never let this die. So thank you very much. Happy to talk with you and connect.
That was amazing, Andy. Thank you. And I think, as you promised at the beginning, you kept it lighthearted the whole way through, which was super fantastic. I think massive amount of amazing information there. I'm pretty sure he doesn't have shares in Nature's Bounty vitamin D supplier, but just really trying to make sure we've got the right information. We are now at lunchtime. I think as we heard, if there are eggs there, maybe don't eat the dozen to try to up your vitamin D intake today, but perhaps look at what that looks like